So, hello. This is loud and this is a big room, and welcome. My name is Christian. That's Philip. He's here with me. We're actually the two lawyers following the comedy talk, so hope you got a few laughs with that, but we're trying to keep it a little bit serious. Why so serious? Hi. It's weird to be back on a stage again. It's weird to be back at DroidCon again. For the last 1.5 years, like everyone else here in the room, we've been giving talks through a video camera, and now being back on stage, having those blinding lights, puts me a little bit off, so please bear with us. But it's great to be back, it's great to be here again, and what we are going to talk about today is actually a little bit linked to what we have seen within the last 1.5 years. It is the shape of media regulation, the shape of how we consume media, of how we consume news, but also how we participate in user-generated content and how we participate in the publication of content and events has changed dramatically through the years. And there is a lot of new regulation coming, which is also very relevant for every developer, for every creator, for everyone who is actually releasing apps and app stores. We will come to that. Therefore, we wanted to give you a short insight of what is happening. So what we're going to do today is we're going to do a short introduction. After that, we're going to talk a little bit about the specific media regulation now coming in Germany into force. Then, in particular, Philipp will talk about use protection, which is a very, very German-specific topic, but that's wrong. It's not a German-specific topic, but we have German specialties that he will explain. Well, then we're going to give you a little picture of what is going to happen within the next years before we wrap up in Q&A. And we reserved some times for any questions. Two lawyers on stage, ask us anything. I'm not sure if we can answer any one of those of your questions, but we will try. So, Philipp.
Thanks, Christian. I work as an associate with Osborne Clark in our Cologne office. I've been with the firm for 2 years now. I studied law before that in Cologne and Paris. And during my studies, I worked as a journalist, did a journalism training, and that's how I ended up in media and IT law at the end. Now, I don't write that much on normal news anymore, but write more publications on media regulation, youth protection, and we also have a blog from our law firm. So if you're interested in legal developments, you can always watch that, follow that on gameslaw.org, or for the German people in the audience, spielerecht.de.
Hi, I'm Christian. I've been a lawyer for over a decade now, and I've been with Osborne Clark for the last 4 years. I started out as a classic IP lawyer and moved then more in the field of IT and data protection. And also data protection was the talks I had the last times at DroidCon. This time it's a little bit changed. If you want to get in contact, just write us. Contact details are on our speaker profiles. So Osborne Clark, who's interested, we are an international law firm. We have offices all over the world. In particular, we are having offices in the US, where we have an office. We were one of the first German and UK-based law firms opening an office in the Silicon Valley in the old .com bubble, end of the 90s. For those who've seen the hacker movie yesterday, this was the time when we opened up our office. And yeah, we are based also in Asia, and we have a strong presence in Europe, and we are originated in the UK. But that's enough advertising. Now let's begin. Media regulation, in particular in German. What is the actual framework for media regulation in Germany? And what is it about and where it's coming from? When you take a look how media consumption evolves throughout the last years, this is how it started 10 years ago. I remember when I was in law school, almost 15 years back, we actually had a subscription for a paper which was delivered to our door every day, and I had a fight with my flatmates almost every morning who gets which section of the paper, because you couldn't separate it. Who has the foreign affairs part had the foreign affairs part, and no one else could read the foreign affairs part. So this has changed. Media became digitalized. Media became more replaceable, or it was easier to access high quality media from all over the world. I mean, almost 10 years ago, as a lawyer, I worked a little bit into press law, and it was a problem to get specific newspapers in Berlin. So if you wanted to get a New York Times, you had to drive to the central station because there was this one kiosk who was actually selling a New York Times. Now you have an iPad and can simply access everything. So this has changed, and within the last years, we saw the development until here. We saw it until the platform regulation. We saw it into media gets bundled into new offers. Media is consumed not only as one specific newspaper, but more like one single source of truth, where you have all those media outlets that you can access on the same time. So we did change from we have one specific media outlet or one specific paper to now we have platforms bundling media offers. And the regulation we had like 15 years ago was focused on you have one specific newspaper. So this won't be fitting for what is now going on in the platform economy, in the platform world. Therefore, in 2016, on European level, the European Commission started to think about new regulation, and this then evolved with over the years. You can see it was a long process, almost as long as GDPR, from 2018, then to 2019, then to 2020, where we actually got now the new German media regulations, the so-called Interstate Media Treaty, which is a law, but this is more like a legal specialty, but as we have in German the structure of federal states, media regulation is actually on a federal level. So all the federal states agreed on this treaty, which has the same classification as a law and is binding as a law. And therefore it's called an Interstate Media Treaty and it's not called a law. And what are the relevant services that are actually regulated? We have classic broadcasting, we're going to come to this. Then we have relatively new broadcasting like telemedia. And just to understand, when we say telemedia as lawyers, we actually mean an app, a website, an online service. Everything that you access on a digital level through the internet, this is what we call a telemedia. And broadcasting like telemedia, we'll come to that, are like websites or services or apps which are comparable to classic broadcasting. And then we have three new categories which are very important, which will main focus. These are media platforms, user interfaces, and media intermediaries. All are, as you can see from the names, are specifically created to regulate this new platform media economy we are in now. And then we have video sharing services. This is your YouTube or your Vimeo or your regular user-generated content video platform. Classic broadcasting is understood in a legal sense as a linear broadcasting, meaning it is starting at one specific point in time, it's ending at one specific point in time, and the user has no influence on when it starts and when it stops. So it's your regular TV, but it also, and here becomes interesting, and we had some cases on that with Twitchers and YouTubers, and because in Germany, normally when you offer broadcasting, you would need a license. And Philipp?
Yeah, so in the past, when we were thinking about broadcasting, it was always that we had these huge TV companies. They were the people doing broadcasting, and that's why we had a regulatory framework that was designed to regulate broadcasting, aka TV stations. And now all of a sudden, we had people streaming videos on Twitch or other platforms. And the problem was that this regulatory framework said, if you're doing live streams of any sorts, you are classified as a TV station. So you have to comply with all the obligations that a huge TV company has to comply with. And that led really to really weird cases, because we had sometimes Twitch streamers, they had a couple of dozen followers, not more, that received letters from German media authorities saying, hey, we saw you're regularly doing live streams on Twitch. You need to apply for a license if you want to continue doing that. And that development was crazy because the media authorities themselves, they also said, we're really sorry, we know that this doesn't make any sense. But that's what the law says. We can't do anything else. We can't do anything against that. And luckily, the legislator realized it really doesn't make any sense to regulate people doing smaller live streams, so they updated the framework. And now we have exemptions if you're only doing very, very small live streams, or if the streams that you're doing are of little importance for public opinion. So now, if you're streaming as a hobby and you don't have a lot of viewers, you don't need to care about a broadcasting license anymore. However, the threshold isn't that high. If you have more than 20,000 viewers on average, that means, within the last 6 months, that means it could require that you still need a broadcasting license nowadays. So if you have a stream and somehow it gets traction, it gets viewers, you may still fall under broadcasting regulation. You still may be required to obtain a broadcasting license. The problem, what we as lawyers have at the moment, and also the streamers have in the end, 20,000 viewers on average, nobody knows what that means. So does it mean only during your live stream? Or if you do a show of 1 hour in the evening and then let the live stream run for the next 23 hours with nothing, is the average counted for the entire time? So that's something we simply don't know at the moment. But what's important to remember is if you regularly do live streams, for example, every Friday evening, and you have a lot of viewers, you still might be required to obtain a broadcasting license under German law.
And obtaining such a license, this is not like rocket science. This is actually not so complicated. It comes with a lot of obligations in the end, but getting the license, it's not the rocket science, but it's simply doing this. It's like having the permit to do something. So, but this has changed within the media treaty on broadcasting. It changed a little bit more to adapt to the new world. Then we got this term of broadcasting like telemedia, and what is it actually? You can see it on the screen. What are the legal requirements? In practice, it is your Netflix. If you have like one offer that is bundled and everything within it is controlled by the entity who is providing this offer, and not only which providers are allowed on it or which news outlet, but like with your Netflix, everything is under Netflix control. Then you got your broadcasting like telemedia, meaning you got one single source where you can go to. This regulation came into force to cover all those Netflix. It is actually a discussion if Spotify is also to be considered at a broadcasting like telemedia. Problem with that is actually that you have podcasts on it which are not on the under the editorial control of Spotify. Therefore, yeah, I don't think it will be considered broadcasting like telemedia, but that's an ongoing discussion. Then you have those two new things. Those are media platforms and user interfaces. Your media platform is everything, or is an offer that bundles specific content providers who are selected and put into an overall offer. What it's most likely to be considered as a media platform are the news outlets of the big social networks, could be. And Philipp, another example, I'm just thinking.
The media platforms, just for example, yesterday I checked into the hotel, and over their Wi-Fi they gave access to a set range of newspapers. And that's what we consider a media platform under German law. Everywhere where you have one provider who has a set catalog of media that you can access, that's a media platform. And it's regulated because regulators have this idea, we don't want one company to have this influence that decides on its own what media is pushed to the top, what's pushed to the bottom. In the classic world, media platforms were cable TV networks, because the network provider is the one who decides what TV stations have access to the network. And that's why we have this regulation of media platforms. And nowadays, it also applies to online services. And very fast, it also applies to apps.
And within the obligations for media platforms, user interfaces are simply the control level of media platforms. So if you have like an app who can access different media platforms, you are a user interface. And what Philipp mentioned is we are coming, when we're talking about media platforms, we are coming from a cable world. And within the cable world, we had a limited amount of broadcasting stations that you could have on your cable network because the number of cables was limited. So this has also changed. We don't have there is no technical limitation on how many media outlets you can have on a platform. And this leads to the situation that you need to have strict rules what actually you need to do when you're running a media platform. And this is most likely you are not allowed to discriminate on the platform. You are allowed to make differences, but those have to be between different news providers. But those have to be objective criteria, like how much monthly user does a specific service has. When it has more users, I can rank it more on the top. When it has fewer users, I can rank it more down. But all those criteria that you need on decision-making, on the ranking, need to be on an objective and non-discrimination level. Secondly, you have to inform people about it. You have to be transparent. What are your ranking criteria? Why is one service ranked down while another one is ranked up? And if you have, and this is a specialty in Germany, the media authorities are going to agree within the next month which news outlets are called public value. They have most likely a high influence on the public opinion and stand for qualitative journalism. And those have to be ranked higher or have to have a preferred treatment on a platform. And this is where's the regulator coming here from? They're coming actually from the fight against toxic news, against fake news and all that stuff, because they're saying, okay, we want to have trustful journalist sources more high on the top than news outlets who might not actually be so obliged to tell the truth about things.
So yeah, and besides media platforms, where we say we have one provider that actively decides on the content that will be available on the platform, we also have so-called media intermediaries. Those aren't these closed shops, but open platforms. And that can be everything where you make content available, also journalistic content, from third parties. For example, search engines, news aggregators. All of these services where you combine content from the internet or from open systems, where you don't make an editorial decision as to the content that you will provide. That's what we call a media intermediary. The regulation applies in particular to social networks, but also, and that goes very, very fast, if you have an app, for example, where you aggregate news from third-party sources, you're already operating a media intermediary. And that also comes with a lot of obligations.
And you don't have to be, so the purpose of your app doesn't have to be a media intermediary. So you can have like an app for outdoor hiking, simply showing routes of outdoor hikings and the best routes for that you can take for a hike. But if you combine it with a feature saying, okay, and if you are getting to the destination you want to get to, here are the 5 media outlets in the region and with recommendations what to do. This part where you aggregate news, where you aggregate journalistic editorial content of this app might turn your app into being a media intermediary. And this will also lead to the obligation also of transparency saying, okay, you have to be transparent about what people have to do to be part of your media intermediary. What is the ranking criteria? Why are people ranked down? Why are people ranked up? You are also under the obligation to not to discriminate between different media outlets that you have on or content providers that you have on. And you have to, when you're not German-based, we'll come to that in a second, you have to appoint a recipient of service. And this is something that we see through all out media regulation. Everyone, when you are not based in Germany, but your service is aimed at Germany, you are most likely obliged to appoint someone who actually can receive letters from authorities. You can appoint law firms to that, you can simply have an office here in Berlin, or you can nominate someone who is obliged or entitled for you to do that. But you need to have some point of contact here in Germany, and that's something that comes from the fight of media authorities against companies who are offering services in Germany, but are actually not based here. Last but not least, we have the video sharing services. This is your normal YouTube content, user-generated content system. And with this, it comes also that you have to appoint a service, and you have to specific obligations within your terms and conditions. And also, and this is something that Philipp going to talk about, or we're going to talk about in a minute, you have quite an extensive obligations under use protection and under network enforcement acts and stuff that could actually hit social networks. So, and now the questions, does this all apply even to me because I'm US based? I'm not based in Germany. And there we have to we have to make a deviation between broadcasting and those three other categories we mentioned: media intermediaries, media platform, and user interfaces. For those last three, we have a GDPR style. If you are offering the service in Germany, it doesn't matter where you are based. Even if you are based somewhere out in the valley, if you are based in Bogota, if you are based in Africa, I don't know, if you're based in Morocco, it applies to you. The first three, or broadcasting, it depends actually on, are you European-based? Then you can rely that only the regulation of the European country relates to you. This is why a lot of companies are actually media companies are based in Ireland. Or if you are US-based, it will apply to you if you're offering your services in Germany and you don't have an outlet within the European Union. So most likely, media regulation at some point will affect you if you offer your services here in Germany. The last one, and this is why is media regulation coming from? It is simply within the last years we have seen a lot of disinformation. We've seen a lot of fake news and a lot of information that led to a toxic environment. And the media regulation is actually there, or the authorities are coming from, and when we are talking to authorities for our clients, we get this feedback. They're saying, hey, we want to have a safe media environment. This is why we have this media regulation. And this is also when I want to give to you, when building news apps or building media apps, think about what information you actually want to distribute and how you want to maybe influence the public opinion. And now, over to use protection. I'm not going to do that on stage.
Thanks. Youth protection is also a topic that's very, very important because it's an international one. And it's also important because the definition of what content are we talking about is drastically changing all the time. When I look at the audience, some of you might remember
I used to play that one.
We realized yesterday, I never played it, he grew up with it. That's River Raid. And I know these images are really, really shocking for you because it's such a brutal game. That's at least what media regulators said in 1984. River Raid was the first video game ever that was put on the so-called index in Germany, practically banning it from being sold on the open market. Because what youth protection authorities said at the time, this game practically gives a paramilitary training to children. And it's so brutal and so shocking we can't let minors have any access to this game at all. And that's why River Raid was put on the index. Nowadays, that won't surprise anybody, it's available for all ages in Germany. But we always have this concept that, first of all, what might be unsuitable for minors is something that changes over time, and that also changes depending on where you're located. For example, the game Sims. In Germany, it has an age rating 6+. Death Stranding, in most European countries, under the PEGI labeling, it's rated 18. In New Zealand, in Australia, for example, Death Stranding was rated 15+. In Russia, Sims 4 obtained an 18+ rating because you can have same-sex relationships. So what different countries see as potentially problematic is very, very different. And that leads to the problem that you always have as developers. I guess almost no one is only distributing an app that's only accessible in one market. You're not selling a newspaper in Germany for Germans. You're sharing content across the entire globe. And we have dozens and dozens of rating systems worldwide. And in theory, you would have to ensure that your app is compliant in every single country in the world. The conventional approach for these age ratings that we have in Germany is that we look at the content. How much violence do we have in a game? Are there people swearing? This is also something that's very different. In Germany, it's not that problematic if you say fuck and shit in a game. In other countries, you know, from US television, that's something that would be beeped out. So we look at the content of the game, and some rating systems also have so-called content descriptors. You know that, for example, also already from the Google Play Store or other stores, where they also give you additional information on content that is included. And that's something with the latest update to German law that is also now being introduced in Germany. New legislation states that rating organizations should also use descriptors that describe why was this game rated 16+ or 18+, and not only give this rating. We always have to say these ratings don't say that a game is great, is recommended for the intended audience, but just that it won't harm them. So games of chess, for example, are usually available for all audiences. That doesn't mean that a 3-year-old is going to be well-suited playing this chess game, but if you give a 3-year-old this game, he won't run into any harm.
He will most probably destroy the figures, but...
Yeah. What we have in Germany is the problem that legislation comes from before the internet. So we have two completely different sets of regulation. We have online media and we have offline media. Offline media, every game that is sold on Blu-ray, on DVD, on a CD is regulated by the federal government. Everything that's online is regulated by the federal states. So it's a completely different framework, and the difference in approach is that offline content, you go to a rating organization. In Germany, it's USK. They look at the content and they will give you a rating, and at the end, this rating is given to you in an officially legally binding administrative act by authorities. In the online world, you usually rely on a self-classification. So as a publisher, you look at the content and you assess what age would be appropriate. There are rating organizations that help you make this assessment. Fortunately, if you're publishing on the Google Play Store, we have the so-called IARC system. That's the International Age Rating Coalition. If you publish an app on the Google Play Store, you have to fill out this questionnaire that asks what kind of content is in the game. And based on this assessment that you give, the system automatically develops age ratings. And these ratings are different depending on the country that users will afterwards access the content. So that means you don't have to care about the rating because the system automatically gives you this rating. There are currently 6 rating organizations that are working together. And for distributions via the Google Play Store, the Microsoft Store, Nintendo eShop, Oculus, PlayStation, they all rely on IARC. That means, in theory, when it comes to age ratings, you don't have to worry about it that much. There are sometimes exceptions because the rating that you obtain is generated automatically based on this questionnaire. That means the system relies on information that was previously fed into the system. Fortnite, the first time it was published online, obtained a rating 16+. When they then released the game on the German market afterwards on DVD, that was the first time that youth protection authorities took the game, really assessed it, and decided it's not that problematic. A 12+ rating is okay. And in the public, that led to a lot of confusion. Why is this game that was previously 16+ now only rated 12+? That's the problem that you always have with automatic rating systems, but it's also an advantage of this automatic rating system because the questionnaire and the rating system behind that is constantly updated. For example, one of the most relevant updates that we have at the moment is that we're starting to look not only at the content, how much blood is in the game, is there swearing, is there nudity, but we're also looking at so-called interaction risks. And that means that a lot of apps that were previously not considered unsuitable for minors will now potentially have changes to their age ratings because of, for example, communication functionalities that you integrate. If you offer the users the possibility to chat, that may affect your age rating. In-app purchase functionalities, gambling-like mechanics, sharing user data, all of these aspects are now elements that potentially may affect the age rating. So those are also elements that you should consider from the start when developing an app, whether you might also take different approaches to user profiles, for example. If you know that your audience is underage,
and that's that's also that we see something that we see on an international level. So we have the Irish data protection authorities or the authorities in France or in the UK who are saying, okay, you are not allowed to give minors a chance to give an unfree consent that they actually don't understand. You have to do an appropriate design of anything that you ask your users in order to obtain from them a consent to use data or to have a communication with other users of the platform. And where the legislators are on an international level are coming there from is that we have seen all those cases of cyber grooming, of everything else. And to protect minors in a safe environment and give them a safe space within the online world, this is where the legislators are coming from there on a national, but even on an international level. So this is not a German specific, but this is something that you will deal all over the world with.
So, yeah, and why should you care if we have IARC? First of all, this entire IARC system only works in participating storefronts. If you have an app that's also available, for example, on the Apple App Store on iOS, they don't support IARC, so you don't have this feature there. And youth protection isn't only age ratings. In Germany, for example, you also have to designate a so-called youth protection officer, at least if you are above a certain threshold, if your company is large, if you have a lot of visitors. This youth protection officer must be designated within your app or on the website in a manner that parents can reach out if they have questions regarding youth protection compliance, so that they can address these questions directly, that they have a point of contact within the company. We're also seeing these new developments, platform providers. And that's a really, really broad term, because all online services where users can share user-generated content, and that also includes games, now are required to implement appropriate and effective precautionary measures. That means, for example, that you should, the list isn't exhaustive, so the legal code gives a few examples of things you could do that would be considered effective precautionary measures. For example, that you implement parental control features within your game. That when users upload content, they have the possibility to flag that content as 18+. That you have default settings. For example, that if you ask users their date of birth at the beginning, and you realize this user is 16+, that you restrict the profile, that won't be public by default, as opposed to people that are overage. And all of these elements are mainly designed at providers sitting in Germany, but we also see that more and more of these regulations also apply to companies based abroad. The most relevant one is the designation of an authorized recipient of service. We also already talked about that more and more laws require you to have some kind of address in Germany where media authorities, where youth protection authorities can send official letters. That's not only youth protection under the Network Enforcement Act, for example, that's also required for social networks. So we have a lot of laws that include these obligations. And from a practical perspective, we have a huge increase in enforcement activities. I mean, if you're following the news, you always hear that from GDPR, all these multi-million fines that are being issued everywhere. Now, we're seeing that with youth protection and media regulation, regulators are increasingly hiring people, so they're increasing their staff for enforcement activities, and they're also currently enforcing against providers based abroad, which they didn't do in the past. So you're no longer safe by saying, I'm outside of German borders, I don't have to care. We really see a large increase in enforcement obligation.
So for example, here we have seen that, or it is publicly known that German media authorities are actually at the moment enforcing against the biggest adult entertainment platforms, that they have functional age verification systems. So the authorities are not stopping at the German border and will not so in the future.
And these cases that are currently performing against the adult entertainment websites are seen as test cases because they're really, once again, trying to look at, can we block access to these websites if they don't comply? And that's why these model cases, we don't know how far that will reach for other content afterwards, but it's very likely that that will have implication not only for these websites where it's very clear that that could be unsuitable for minors. We also have rating obligations for platforms that will now apply. That's more or less only relevant if you operate a platform. But most importantly, we only had 40 minutes of talk here. So we could only cover a really small part of what's happening at the moment. We have a huge development on the European level, on the German level, and also in the other European member states of activities related to youth protection, to media regulation, and also linked to data protection, for example.
Yeah, and it's specifically the last three, the ICO, which is the UK Data Protection Agency, the Irish Data Protection Agency, and the French, the CNIL, the Data Protection Authorities. They're all taking under consideration now for possible data protection violations if your data protection setup is suitable for minors? Do minors, if you're targeting minors, do the minors understand what is actually happening to their personal data? Do you have specific pre-default settings for minors? So I think it was with Kneal and the Irish that they are actually saying, if you know that you are targeting a minor, you must turn off geo-tracking by default, which might lead to the situation that you have two completely different setups within your app. One, if you're targeting or used by an adult, and the other, if your app is used by a minor, because if you have a minor as a customer, you are not allowed to use geo-tracking. So this will come in the future. Even more use protection will become more important, as you will have two different setups for your apps or for your interfaces.
And once again, these obligations apply regardless of where you are based as a service. If you have users that are based in the UK, or users that are based in France, or users that are based in Germany or in Ireland, then you will have to comply with these obligations.
And as a last word, if you ask which is the most important here on this, I think it will be actually the Digital Services Act, which is pretty much in the beginning. It will be, it's still a negotiation on European Commission level, but it is actually on a European level the legislation concerning all kind of content and how to fight toxic content and toxic behavior on the internet. On a level, in a nutshell, and this will massively influence on how we have content regulation within the next years. Thank you. We are a little bit over time, but still okay, I hope. If you have any questions,
we wrote on the slide that we reserve time for questions, but
we were lying. We are lawyers.
We're happy to discuss afterwards, outside of the stage.
Thank you.
Thank you.